Here we are at our second World Test Championship final. Because this is not like a normal tournament in kind of any way, it is worth looking at how these two teams made it over their incredibly long journey. This was obviously a little bit weird as India left the tour midway through, and because of that they probably gave up a pretty easy chance of winning the final match and series against what was then a very struggling England. They drew the first game, but they ran through England's top order at Lord's with quick bowling in the last innings. Considering the history of these two teams, watching Indian seamers destroy England openers was quite the turnaround, meaning that after two tests, England were up 1-0. But the next match, Anderson and Robertson ran through India on day one, and for the second test in a row, Root held them up, and now the series was 1-1. When India fell for 191 in the following match, it looked like England would take control of the entire series as they had a 99-run lead. But almost every batter in the Indian lineup chipped in behind Rohit's 100, and they ended up setting England 368. Which for a little while looked like England might be able to get there as their openers made a 100-run stand, but then India worked their way through the rest to take a one-test lead. Then they went home over a COVID scare. So now fast forward quite a few months, and when they came back to play the final match, they did so against an entirely different team. India essentially got baseballed. But even then they made 400 in their first innings, which usually would have been enough to beat England on its own. At the halfway point they had a lead of 132 runs. But they played a bit of a soft third innings where most of their players got set but none went on, and then Bairstow and Root destroyed them in a chase of 378 in no time. Now, a lot went on there. But if you came into this series saying India went home 2-2, I think that's probably par for India at that point. But they probably could have won their series 3-1. The side that beat India in the first World Test Championship final was already starting to disband at this point, and they turned up with really only one spinner. In fact, Ajaz Patel would end up with all the wickets in one innings to really force that message home for everyone. But New Zealand did fight in the first match. India had a 50-run lead halfway through when Jamieson took a couple of early wickets in their third innings. Because of that, India batted very carefully to make a lead. They scored at 2.88 runs an over as Har put them in front. It meant that they only had one day to dismiss the Kiwis, and Will Somerville's 100-ball night watch effort took a good chunk of that away from that. But quite a few of the New Zealanders chipped in before Ravidan and Ajaz stole a draw with 9 wickets down. The next test, India was back to being themselves, but it's hard to feel like they didn't miss out a little bit in this series by not ending up 2-0. This was the slip up. South Africa was in the middle of a batting crisis at this point. They had Elgar, Peterson and Bavuma, and pretty much nothing else. Just a competent Indian effort with the bat would have had them winning this easily because of their bowling talent. And they got the biggest bonus ever in the series because Shardul took 12 wickets at 19, including a 7-wicket haul. First test, their batting showed up. 117 opening stand with KL Rahul, who would go on to make 123 in his own. That was enough to beat South Africa, who never passed 200 in the match. The second test was low scoring. South Africa had a small lead going into the back half when India made 266 in the third thanks to a bunch of starts from their players. That gave South Africa a fairly tough chase of 240. And Dean Elgar sliced, nudged and edged his way to 96 not out to win the match with only 3 wickets down. The third test followed a fairly similar script, except India had the small lead this time. And on this occasion, India struggled a little bit more in the third innings, but Pant made 100, and basically half of India's score, that meant South Africa had to chase 212, which again was fairly tough on a pitch like this. This time it was Peterson, not Elgar, who made the runs, as South Africa chased this one pretty easily as well. I think we know that South Africa is a good spoiler team, and we saw them almost take a test off Australia and actually defeat the basballing English. But to lose 2 matches to South Africa shows that your batting is just not functioning as well as you would like it to. I had India beforehand as winning the series 2-1, so it wasn't a massive failure, but you look back at the series and you think they could have won it 3-0. Nothing that surprising happened when Sri Lanka toured India. The tourists never got more than 208 against the Indian bowlers and lost each game by a massive amount. Considering how good Sri Lanka were in this cycle, it was probably more disappointing for them, but it's more or less what we would have expected from India. When they arrived in Bangladesh, I had India down as 2 wins from the start, and the first test was won very easy by India despite a decent last innings from Bangladesh. The second test got a little bit tense though. Bangladesh made 230 in each innings and India needed 145 to win. but Mahdi Hassan removed pretty much the entire top order, and in the end it was Akshar Patel and R. Ashwin's batting that got them home with only 3 wickets in hand. They still got their 2-0 in this series, but they didn't look quite as dominant as they had done in some of the others. This series will probably cover a little bit more in the Australian section in a moment, but it is worth talking about the Indian side here briefly. I wrote at the time that making wickets that much in the favour of bowlers means that there is a chance of a fluke win, and in some ways that is what happened with Australia's third test. If India hadn't qualified for the World Test Championship because of the last 2 matches, it would have been a huge outcry. But they did, and they still won the series. But again, it wasn't quite the way that they would have wanted. I would say that the Sri Lanka and Bangladesh series were the only ones where they really met my expectations for them. But that's also partly because I do rate them so highly coming in. But they just weren't as clinical as they could have been against Australia, England, South Africa or New Zealand. Their batting is a concern. For instance, in this cycle they only have 1 batter averaging more than 45, and that's Akshar Patel, which is not ideal. Part of that is obviously playing on wickets at home that are meant to destroy batters. And look at their runs, those wickets have done that. But it's not just the batting. Ishant Sharma was eased out of their bowling, Mohammad Siraj and Umesh Yadav have been okay, but it's not like they were in the previous cycle where they had so many seamers available to them at any point, and all of them were starring. Their spinners have obviously done great, there is no issue there, but overall this isn't quite the team of before. Their seam unit isn't as inspiring right now, and their batters just aren't making big totals. They're going to need one, if not both of those things in this game. And it's also worth mentioning that they probably just weren't as clinical all the way through as they could have been. Let's move on to Australia's road to the WTC Final. Sadly, by Stuart Broad's decree, this series never actually happened. But the weird thing is that the ICC has not listened to the blonde truth teller, and so Australia's points still count. We kind of all know the story. England were not very good at that stage. They were in the middle of an epic funk. Plus they dropped like 1 million catches to drop the series. But it is worth noting how brutal Australia were. Because if you look back in the 2019 Ashes or the last BGT, they had gotten themselves into good positions and then let them go. This time they pushed harder and harder when they got on top of England until we were basically all saying, stop, he's already dead. And remember that it was also a feeling coming into the World Test Championship that long series didn't help teams. And they really shouldn't. But England was so bad that Australia actually got a massive amount of points from this series. In fact, the only problem Australia had was they couldn't dismiss Broad or Anderson at Sydney, which meant that it was 4-0 and not 5-0. And that probably only bothers the people who were counting the points and Glenn McGrath. But 4 wins is still huge. The most amazing thing about this is that Australia went to Pakistan at all. And this series might have helped them on their way to the final, but obviously for what it stands for, the first team to stop travelling to Pakistan, coming back there, it means a lot more to cricket and Pakistan in general. But from a WTC perspective, this is when Pakistan went in with the flattest of flat wickets, although not if you listen to the commentators of that series bizarrely. Hello Rambo if you're listening. This was a very interesting series because Australia really planned their way through it and they knew it was going to be tough. Pat Cummins discussed it as if the 3 tests were all one long game, and watching that series, that's kind of exactly how it felt. And Australia didn't just have to beat Pakistan, but perhaps the harder opponent was just getting a result on the Pakistani surfaces at all, especially playing conventional cricket. In retrospect, England's way probably made a lot more sense. But Australia did play well, and right at the end of that series, they finally got their win. I actually assumed that Australia would get 1 win on that series anyway when I was making my predictions, but I didn't really see the 2 draws coming. So that was a bonus. Now since then, I think we've learned that Pakistan were definitely a bit of a ramble. But at the time, many of us rated this series quite high. After England and New Zealand were there, it looked a little bit more matter of fact. Remember that Australia came into this cycle with 3 series in Asia, and of that, this was the one that they probably had the most chance in. But Sri Lanka were better than anyone expected in this cycle, and remember that they almost snuck into the final themselves. But Australia smashed them in that first match, winning by 10 wickets. However, they lost the second test by an innings when Jayasuriya went through their lower order. The other problem, of course, was they were about to go off and face not 1, but 2 better left-arm orthodox bowlers in India. I think before this series I had them listed as 1 win and 1 loss. And so I don't think this was a bad result at all, even if the second test was a little bit like swimming in a cold cup of coffee. This was a given. No one assumed the West Indies would win or even draw a test without some sort of minor miracle. Australia made over 500 in both first innings, and the West Indies batting held up okay in the first match, but Australia had clearly worked them out by the last game. I suppose because South Africa stole a test in England and their bowling suits Australia, maybe South Africa could have gotten one from the Aussies as well. However, it is worth remembering that it is almost impossible to win on Australian pitches without fairly sizable totals, because Australians aren't generally rolled very cheaply at home that often. However, the first test was probably the one that South Africa could have stolen, but an innings by Travis Head really changed everything there, and from then on the Aussies declared on 2 huge totals and South Africa were not even in the matches at all. But rain played a big part in the last test and South Africa held on for a draw. That meant that Australia lost 2 wins to draws in this home cycle. But the draws in Pakistan and the win in Sri Lanka probably overcame this a little bit. And now we have the BGT. 2 tests in, this looked like it was about to be as ugly as it could possibly be. Australia was averaging around 15 runs per wicket. The batters did not look like they could find an answer for the modern fast square turners of India. Plus, even though Murphy was incredible, India had 3 better spinners than him or Lyon. Also remember they had sent Agar home and everyone else seemed to be injured at various times. At this point, 2 tests in, India was completely dominant and it felt like Australia was having one of those tour of hells where lots of really good books come out of but not much else. But they got a break in the 3rd test as India had just as much trouble on the tricky surfaces as the Aussies had, and their chase was small enough that they could get there without too much trouble at all. The 4th match was a draw on a wicket that looked, completely alien compared to everything else in this series so far, but it meant that they stole a win on this series and also got a draw. Again, that is better than what I had them down for. I thought a 3-1 win to India was Australia's best chance. To get a draw as well was a bonus. In fact, but obviously it was a lot more dramatic than that, because after 2 test matches, it looked like they were going to go home, and instead, they had a massive comeback. So you look at all this, and the thing to note is that they overperformed in several series. Pakistan, India, and versus England. They did what you would expect in the others, and all things considered, this was a really good cycle for the Australians. Depending on how you feel about David Warner, they sorted out their opening partnership, they unlocked Travis Head, found a functioning all-rounder who could be better than that, a secondary spinner who might take over the main role one day, had backup seamers who did incredibly well. There was a lot going on for Australia that was very, very good. For instance, they had 4 batters averaging more than 50 and 5 bowlers who took a lot of wickets at an average better than 30. And they did all of this with Josh Hazlewood only playing 4 matches. This was a crazy hot WT cycle for the Australians. But that is now all distant history, right? What about this game coming up? Because coming into this final, India are without Jasprit Bumrah and Rishabh Pant. And now obviously Australia doesn't have Josh Hazlewood either. However, Australia haven't actually had that much of him in this cycle already. And the way that Boland has bowled, they have a pretty good facsimile of him. He is at least another tall bowler who is reasonably accurate, who can move the ball around. There is no replacement for Jasprit Bumrah. He is one of one, not just in India, but I've never seen another bowler with his mix of skills exist. And Rishabh Pant is on track to be one of the greatest keeper batters of all time. For instance, Ishan Kishan averages 10 less in first class cricket than Rishabh Pant does. And while he has talent, it is not like for like. KS Barrett is more, excuse me while I clear my throat, a literal safe pair of hands. And so in every way you look at it, the Indian players are far more irreplaceable. And so Australia are favourites, and the bookies are really enjoying their work at the moment. But in truth, India is still a very good team. But in the last couple of years, they have been messier than the Australians. The Aussies just made a lot of runs, and don't let others do that. But a lot of that has to do with the pitches at home. Of course, this is not a home test, and no one has played in ages, and when they last did, they were on a polite Indian pitch. You've got heaps of players coming over from the IPL, a few that have been hanging out in county cricket, and some that have been not doing that much at all. We don't have a great idea of recent form. We don't have any data on how the oval pitch will play, as tests usually aren't played in this period. Neither team is using their own personal ball, and one side is keeping half an eye on the next 5 tests. This game is less of a major final and more like a random pop quiz, making it even more random than most finals ever are. Australia might have been the better team over the entire run, but if Spider-Cam gets loose and falls on Pat Cummins' arm 10 minutes into play, who knows what will happen next? The best thing about the WTC Final is that it is like a one-off heavyweight fight. No home conditions, no warm-ups, just 2 teams parachuted in, trying to win it all for 1 week only.